I need a script. Oh, Ms. Becker. Have you got a question? It's a big deal. It's one of those things that, Hans, you don't have a script, right? It's much better because see what it does to me? Yeah. Okay, good. Good afternoon. Welcome to our 2022 Terrence R. Keeley Vatican Lecture, brought to you by the Nanovic Institute for European Studies. My name is Clement Sedmak, and I serve as director of the Nanovic Institute. A special word of welcome to Bishop Kevin Rhodes, the 9th Bishop of the Diocese of Fort Wayne, South Bend. I would also recognize our Dean and his wonderful wife, and members of the Congregation for the Holy Cross. Thank you for being here. And of course, a special word of welcome to Father Hans Zollner, our guest of honor and our distinguished speaker. Father Hans has celebrated the Eucharist with us this morning, and it makes such a difference to come together with this uniting experience as a foundation. The Nanovic Institute's mission is quite simple: to bring Europe to Notre Dame and to bring Notre Dame to Europe. We bring an important European voice to campus this afternoon and a global topic. Today's lecture's topic is: how is the Catholic Church safeguarding children? A perspective after the recent developments in Europe. Children are especially vulnerable agents. The safeguarding of children takes both vulnerability and agency into account. Safeguarding expresses a commitment to the dignity of the human person. The concept of dignity is central to what we do. The Nanovic Institute is part of the Keough School of Global Affairs. The Keough School is committed to integral human development. Integral human development, or IHD as we insiders call it, is a term coined by Pope Paul VI. It puts the idea of dignity at the center of any social relation and any social transformation. It refers to the development of each person and the whole person. Each person means everybody, including children and youth, including those who are especially vulnerable, including those who normally have no voice. There is a lot of literature on the fact that children and youth are more often than not excluded from development discourses and also from theological conversations and ecclesial processes. Pope Francis, in his pontificate, has shown a special commitment to vulnerable persons and a special concern with entry points for privilege and exploitation. My task here is to provide a little bit of background to this marquee event of the Nanovic Institute. Our institute was founded through the generosity and foresight of Bob and Liz Nanovic. They love Notre Dame and they love Europe. It was and still is their vision to forge closer ties between the Notre Dame community and Europe through personal encounters, creative research, and formative experiences. The Keeley Vatican Lecture is a particular and significant initiative brought to us by the vision and generosity of Terrence Keeley, who is a member of the advisory board of the Nanovic Institute. Terry Keeley's particular vision ensured that when we think about Europe, this includes a focus on the Vatican, on Catholic culture, and Notre Dame's Catholic heritage. A word about Terry Keeley. Terry Keeley combines an education in philosophy with success in the world of finance. He has been an advisor to the world's largest sovereign wealth funds, national pension plans, endowments, foundations, and asset managers for more than 3 decades. In 2021, he was named a leading global knowledge broker by Chief Investment Officer. Later this year, we will see the publication of Terry's groundbreaking book, Sustainable, Moving Beyond ESG to Impact Investing. It will be published by Columbia Business School Publishing. Terry Keeley has also served as a consultant to Pope Francis's Financial Reform Commission. Through Terry's generosity, we have been able to welcome a number of cardinals and Vatican officials who have offered inspiring lectures. Today, is another special day in the history of this endowed lecture. A word about the choreography of this event. My esteemed and wonderful colleague, Professor Kathy Cummings, will introduce our guest of honor, Hans Zollner. After that, Father Zollner will deliver the Keeley Vatican lecture for 47 minutes, 36 seconds, the most. Then we will have time for insightful questions and respectful comments. At the end, we will express our gratitude. Now may I please ask Professor Kathleen Sprouse Cummings, I call her Kathy, to introduce Father Hans Zollner. Kathy is the Reverend John O'Brien College Professor of History and the William and Anna Jean Kushwa Director of the Kushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism, and a wonderful person. Thank you, Kathy. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Clemens. You forgot to mention I'm a faculty fellow at the Nanovic Institute for European Studies, the greatest honor. The Keeley Vatican lecture is always a highlight of the academic year for me, but this year that's especially true. I congratulate Clemens and the entire staff of the Nanovic Institute for their inspired choice of a speaker for 2022. And of course, I thank the Reverend Dr. Hans Zollner for accepting the invitation to be the Keeley Vatican lecturer this year. I'm deeply honored to introduce him this evening. A native of Regensburg, Bavaria, Father Zollner is a Jesuit priest, theologian, and licensed psychotherapist with expertise in the prevention and healing of childhood sexual abuse. He is ordinary professor at the Institute of Psychology at the Pontifical Gregorian University, where he also directs the Institute of Anthropology. Established in 2012 and known until 2021 as the Center for Child Protection, the recently elevated institute offers multiple degree programs and advances research that places the interdisciplinary study of human dignity at the service of safeguarding vulnerable persons. In 2018, Pope Francis reappointed Father Zollner for a second term as the member of the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors. In 2017, he was appointed to be a consultor for the Vatican's Congregation for Clergy. Father Zollner's research interests include human formation in the training of seminarians and religious worldwide, and he has played a leading role in major international meetings on sex abuse, including the Toward Healing and Renewal Symposium on Sexual Abuse of Minors in February 2012, the World Congress Child Dignity in the Digital World in 2017, and the Vatican meeting on the protection of minors in the Church in February 2019. Since 2015, he has been honorary professor in the Department of Theology and Religion at the University of Durham. Father Zollner has been an editor or contributing author for numerous scholarly volumes on sexual abuse and its prevention, and he has served on the editorial board of multiple journals, including Gregorianum and Religions. He is the author of a 2004 book titled, forgive me, I'm going to use an English translation of the title, Consolation, Increase in Hope, Faith, and Love on the Theological Ferment of the Ignatian Discernment of Spirits. In 2021, Father Zollner published an English language podcast series titled Dignity and Care, featuring long-form conversations on the Church's reckoning with what he has called the double crisis, clergy sexual abuse in the first instance and its cover-up in the second. I had the pleasure of meeting Father Zollner at his office at the Gregorian in December 2018. Over the course of that meeting, and even more so since, I have learned a great deal from him. His vision and work has shaped my own scholarly research on clerical sex abuse, as well as our Kushwa-sponsored projects on the subject. At the same time, his work offers a constant reminder how much farther we need to go, both in terms of researching the sexual abuse crisis, let alone resolving it. Father Zollner persistently reminds us that the sex abuse crisis is a global one, and we must always resist the impulse to impose our Western cultural assumptions and perspectives across global cultures. He himself has given presentations, courses, and workshops in over 70 countries across 6 continents about the Church's efforts to combat childhood sexual abuse. Father Zollner is also relentless in his insistence on the complexity of the crisis of sexual abuse. Because there has been no single cause, efforts to find a resolution to it must be multifaceted and interdisciplinary, enlisting psychologists, theologians, historians, sociologists, and other scholars. He also reminds us that while public and media attention on the crisis may wax and wane, it is our responsibility as scholars, and indeed also as Catholics, to be relentless in studying sex abuse, demanding transparency and accountability, and in working toward healing, not only for the survivors of sex abuse, but for the church itself. When we met in 2018, Father Zollner expressed interest in exploring ways that the University of Notre Dame could support his work or even partner with him in it. I hope that this, his first visit to our campus, will be generative in that respect, and I know he would welcome our ideas. I want to thank Father Zollner for his courage, for his research, and for his generosity throughout his brief time on campus, most of which has been spent in conversation with students and with affiliated colleagues. He will speak to us now on how is the Catholic Church safeguarding children, a perspective after the recent developments in Europe. Please join me in welcoming Father Hans Zollner.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for the introduction to Professor Cummings and for the invitation to the university and Professor Sedmak. Thank you for all who are here, also Bishop Rhodes, and all those who join us online. I'm deeply honored for this invitation, and I'm looking forward to sharing with you some of my reflections and then entering into our conversation on a topic that for many is very difficult to bear, and many would like that it disappears, but we need to face it, and I'm grateful for your presence here and online, which shows that you are not only interested in it, but you engage and commit yourselves to something that is of highest importance for the life of the Church today and for the future. I would like also to welcome Taras Dabko, who is here among us, the Senior Vice President of the UKU, of the Greek Catholic University in Lviv in Ukraine. Actually, my story with this topic started in a certain way in Lviv on 29th of January 2010. I'd come back from lectures at the university to the Jesuit community when I opened my laptop and saw the news about child sexual abuse that was broken in the news in Berlin, and set off the tsunami of news for half a year, and set off, I would say, the second international global wave of news on this topic that started precisely in Lviv. And I'm very much connected to a good number of people in Ukraine, and I would like us to pause just a second, remembering that people are tremendously suffering in this moment, in that part of the world, and that we pray for peace. The Nanovic Institute focuses on European studies, and that is also the reason why in the title of my presentation, Europe is mentioned, although as a member of the University, Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome, we look out to the whole global society and the global church. However, there have been a few things that have happened in Europe over the last half a year or so that has impacted the situation of the Catholic Church as a whole. What I try to do in this presentation now is to give you some points and to invite you to own the topic more, not only as an intellectual exercise, not only as gaining some more insight in some aspects, but also something that you cope with, you try to enter into, you commit to. We cannot continue just listening over and over again to the same words. We need to own it and to act upon. And that includes that we become aware of our own reactions, the human ones, the administrative ones, and the spiritual ones. A university community can do a lot to promote safeguarding in its midst and beyond. And this includes that all of us have a share in this. Nobody can do nothing. All of us can contribute something in his or her position, in his or her role, in his or her responsibility. We can share what we try to achieve together, and that would make a difference. If all of us who are here and who are listening and watching now did what we can do for the safeguarding of vulnerable persons, especially children, our context, our circumstances, our institutions would change a lot. What I would also like to highlight is that what we are going through is being united with the suffering of Christ in victims of abuse, of any kind of abuse. Also the abuse, the sexual abuse that is committed by clergy within the Catholic Church. And with this, I would like also to mention one very important moment for me when I was handing over this painting to Pope Francis in a meeting of the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors in October 2015. You see in the background Cardinal O'Malley, Archbishop of Boston, President of the Pontifical Commission. And a few days earlier, I had received from a survivor of clerical sexual abuse from Canada this painting. And she had asked me to give it to the Pope, what I did in that moment. And you see that she painted Christ crucified to a tree. She calls it the tree of life. What you can't see probably is that Christ's eyes are closed and he cries. He's crying with the victims of abuse. He's crying for them. He's crying about the lack of empathy, the lack of support, the lack of openness, the lack of listening from the side of his church. And there is signs of hope. There are leaves on this tree, and there is a dove that is flying away. And you see from the Pope's expression on his face that he is very much impacted by that. And this is what I've seen with him in some other meetings with survivors of abuse, that he shows a great empathy, not only sympathy, but empathy. He enters into their heart. He let himself be shouted at. He doesn't become defensive when he meets aggressive people. He doesn't shy away from being confronted with very unpleasant words and very uncomfortable truths. And this is what survivors of abuse look for in our church, that we don't run away, that we own the issue, that we are capable also of entering into their lives, into their suffering, into their desperation. And as long as we do it, they can also hope for some healing and some change within us and within the church. However, that is not the only reaction you get when you travel around in Europe and in Africa and in Latin America and in Oceania and in North America and Latin America. You get all kinds of reactions, and this is a typical panorama of what you hear and read. I fear for the church. Why do we talk about this so often, and does it not taint our image? If only I was not so helpless. How did members of my faith community abuse children, and how was I fooled by them? The damage being done by so few hurts us all. When can we finally get back to the real pastoral issues again? It's all a media attack. It's worse with the others. In the families, in the public schools, in sports, with the scouts, and so forth. It's so terrible for the kids. And then many say, I can't take it anymore. Why me? We don't have the time to share what is on your mind and in your heart now when we talk about this, but I'm pretty sure that we would get at least some similar voices like these. That is something that we have seen for many years now. And this is reality. We need to face that. This is reality in many parts of the world. Those that have started to confront and being confronted with the scandals of abuse early on, like Canada, the US, Australia, Ireland, and those who have not yet started to face it, like many countries in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, and in Oceania. If people say this is a passé topic, then good luck. We need to face it. This is just the beginning for the Catholic Church, because in many parts of the world, media and others have not yet taken really seriously this. What we also need to know is how survivors feel and perceive what we do as a church. And these are also typical voices from survivors which I've heard myself in many meetings with them and many relationships that continue. Never ever has anybody listened to me, to my story, and to my hurt. I'm livid that they push away the responsibility. In fact, the Catholic Church seems to many, not only survivors of abuse, an institution in which it is difficult to find out who is responsible for what and who needs to be held accountable for what. I don't know to whom I can turn for support. If only I had not been so powerless. I had blind trust in Father X. I couldn't imagine that he could do anything evil. I've struggled long enough. I give up. Not a few survivors of abuse try to take their own lives, and some succeed. I felt so dirty and guilty. Not the perpetrator, but the victim, in that sense of identification with the perpetrator that we know in psychology of, but when you meet it in reality, it is very difficult to bear and to get out of that circle of shame and self-accusation. If only they had the courage to confess their crimes and do justice to us. They means the church authority, bishops, provincials, generals, vicar generals, judicial vicars, but also lay directors of schools and faculties and so forth. I think we need to be honest, and that means also that we need to understand that many survivors, potentially also in this room now and online, long for a different church and a different attitude and a different understanding. Many ask first and foremost for being listened to, not for money, not for any public attention. In fact, many victims never go public and don't want to. What they want is a listening heart and a listening ear and understanding. And that is the basic human attitude that we all can offer. The situation and reactions in the church worldwide, as I said, the topic is present everywhere, but openness to take it on is not. I've recently published 2 papers together with colleagues from Latin America and Africa respectively on the situation in those continents, and we have called on experts in the field from different countries on those continents and asked them, how is the situation in your part of the world? How do normal people talk about sexuality, sexual misbehavior, and sexual misbehavior by authority figures in the church? And the response, at least for Africa, was unanimously, you don't talk about sexuality at all, let alone sexual misbehavior, let alone sexual misbehavior by authority. And priests are of highest authority in Africa and in parts of Latin America still now. and the same would be true for your southern neighbors. And that's the surprising piece for Anglo-Saxons and for Germans or Western Europeans, that why don't other churches deal with it differently? Why haven't they learned from us? Matter of fact, the church does not exist outside society. Only once society has reached a certain breaking point, when it becomes possible to talk about sexual matters in a certain way, in a certain public way, and address sexual misbehavior, then media will take it on and report on it. Till now, in Italy, this is not the case. And we are waiting for the moment, I'm waiting for the moment that it will also come to Italy. The Italian bishops have not yet decided to establish an independent commission into the cases of abuse from the past. Why? Part of it is because Italian society is not yet ready to do that. Why? Because there are political, economic, and other factors that come in. And other parts of society don't want that this becomes a topic, because tourism, fashion, cinema, sports, and other areas of society in Italy are also very much involved in sexual abuse. So just to say, this is an aspect that we have to realize as those who have gone at least through one or more waves of interest on this topic. If you talk about Central and Eastern Europe, I could go on for quite some time and tell you stories about meeting with bishops, for example in this case from the Czech Republic, who told me they will never report a priest to police, never, even if they know that they have abused minors sexually. A scandal to us, and a scandal in the legal system, but psychologically at least understandable if you know the story of some of these bishops who went through all kinds of repression in their careers as seminarians or as priests, and some of them have been imprisoned and whatever, knowing that police, media, and psychology would be enemies of the church. So how can you learn trust when this has been the situation for many, many decades? However, in most parts of the world, you don't encounter active resistance easily. What is much more present is a great lack of knowledge, a lack of willingness to engage, and a great uncomfortableness. In psychology, we call it also passive aggression and passive resistance. You delay it, you postpone it, you put it on the shelf, you have it in your planning at the last, in the list and the last points, so that there is as little energy spent on it and as little money as possible. This is also the reason why we have in very few countries proactive measures, countering abuse before it happens and taking on the scandal before it breaks. Unfortunately, in most parts of the church where we have had to confront it, the church, the bishops, the provincials waited until it was too late, until media took over. And then the case was lost, because then the bishops were just running after the development and not reaching it ever, because media was always, and public opinion was always a step ahead. This is one of the mysteries in the Catholic Church that I've encountered, that why don't we learn one from the other? There is very little transfer of experience and expertise. We proclaim in the Creed and we teach in ecclesiology that we are one church. Yes, but where does this oneness lie in regard to dealing with cases of abuse? Do we have, all of us, and I talk about local churches like in countries, bishops' conferences, religious congregations, and institutions, do we all have to go through the very painful process that our predecessors have had to face? Do we all have to reinvent the wheel again? Yes, there are cultural, legal, and historical factors that are different from region to region. There is no one-size-fits-all approach. This is difficult to understand if you come from a culture where you think you can fix problems in a certain way. You plan it, you analyze it, you go through it, and then you have a solution to it. Now, if you talk about the Catholic Church, the oldest and the most complex institution in this world, you realize very soon that this is not going to happen, probably in not many areas you could expect it, but certainly not in the area of how we confront the sexual abuse crisis. Because, as I've already mentioned, we talk about it differently, not only because we use different languages, but how we express what we want to share with others is different. How we talk about it, how we think about it. So it is very important to realize that one successful story of how you bring down numbers of new allegations, as in this country has happened over the last 20 years, to a minimum, does not easily translate into other cultures. So each bishops' conference, each local church needs to engage in this. You cannot simply buy a program and then implement it out of context in another area. That is also why factors like what I mentioned before, the cultural, the historical, in one region needs to be considered. Another thing that doesn't help in the protection of minors is that whenever and wherever there is a major adverse circumstance, like the war that we face now in Ukraine, famine, natural disasters, civil unrest and violence, then the topic of child sexual abuse in the past and preventing it, safeguarding minors today and vulnerable adults today gets lost. In the moment the pandemic came about 2 years ago, safeguarding minors became a minor issue because health issues, economy, and safety were first. So children have no lobby in our societies, in fact. We talk about it, but have you heard politicians talk about how we could continue safeguarding measures, what we need to do at the national level, at the regional level, to not only keep the standard, but promote it even in the face of a pandemic that puts children more at risk than normal circumstances? Have you heard about that? Very little. So, and the same is true now, of course, when we talk about the war. We talk about military operations, we talk about safety and economy issues, how do we continue with energy, oil, gas, and whatever. What is lost is that 90% of all refugees in and from Ukraine are women and children. And they are at highest risk of being trafficked and sexually and physically and psychologically abused. Do we hear much about that? Very little compared to the other. So it's something that needs also our constant attention and our awareness, and that needs determination and willingness to face it. Now, over the last 5 years or so, another perspective has come into the consideration of child sexual abuse and beyond. The question that has been called the systemic question. And I would like to give you an example. what that means in regard to what we have seen in Europe over the last years, and especially if we come to France and Munich over the last half year. Let me start with the most recent one. The report in the cases of abuse in the Archdiocese of Munich from 1945 to 2019 brought about the things we know. We had known from a report that was published in 2010, numbers of victims, numbers of perpetrators or accused. What was not known in 2010 and what was now put on the spot was how the officials in the Archdiocese had dealt with allegations and with victims and their families and the parish communities and the school communities where the abuse had happened. Now, from 1945 to 2019, there were 7 archbishops in the Archdiocese of Munich. And none of them, not a single one, handled allegations of abuse and contact with victims as he should have. All of them have had stories of negligence. All of them had stories of denying victims being listened to. All of them had a story of protecting priests, not so with lay people who had abused, but precisely preserving priests and moving them around, even if it was known that there had been abuse committed. Not a single one. And you know why this drew worldwide attention? Because Pope Emeritus Benedict had been Archbishop in Munich from 1977 to 1982, before he was appointed prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. And you know that the response to the questions by the law firm, by his legal team, created an outcry, and then the letter that he himself produced 2 weeks later didn't help much the situation to be clarified. But the important point is there were things that did not work at the institutional level, be they bishops, left-leaning, right-leaning, be they bishops more spiritual and more socially oriented, be they theologians, canon lawyers, or social scientists. Independently from that, something went wrong. And that indicates that it is not only and not mainly, perhaps, an individual, a personal question. There is something within the system church, the institution, the organization, the rules, the procedures that has not helped to confront abuse, to stop it, to do what needs to be done in punishment and penalty and betterment of perpetrators, and in listening and helping survivors of abuse and their families and communities. France, the Bishops' Conference had commissioned 2 years ago a report, an independent report. The president was a highly renowned personality in France, Sauvé, and they presented the report on 5th of October last year with different working groups, and one, the sociological piece, created a huge outcry because there was an estimate that went beyond imagination in terms of how many victims were estimated to have been from 1950 till 2015 in France. Numbers that are so huge that we can hardly understand them, let alone acknowledge them. The report talks about 220,000 victims in France in that period of time, victims of clerical sexual abuse, plus 110,000 victims, estimate, victims of sexual abuse committed by lay employees in the church, which makes up for 330,000 victims in the church in France in about 70 years. Too big for us to understand what this means. Much criticism about the methodology. You can discuss that, but anyway, it is one of the facts that the numbers of victims about whom we know is only a small portion, maybe 10% of the real number. This is true for the Catholic Church, this is true for sports associations, this is true for families, and so forth. Because the vast majority of victims don't share that, don't want to share it, and will never tell, not even their spouses. Poland. When I was with this topic for the first time in Warsaw in 2013, I gave a workshop, and then we met with the then Secretary General of the Bishops' Conference, who is now the Primate of Poland, Archbishop Polak, and we met with the Nuncio, who shared their knowledge about abuse cases, about whom they knew, very grievous cases. But many people in the workshop said, what you talk about is a Western problem, is something that happens in secularized societies of the decadent West. And in communism, we didn't have schools, we didn't have institutions, so priests were not in contact regularly with young people, so we don't have this problem. As it turns out, the numbers in Poland will probably be the same as in proportion as in other countries, even if there were no schools and no other institutions. Fact is that a good number of priests who had abused had been called by police and offered the opportunity to work with them as spies, as versus going public with the news that he had abused a minor. So we can assume that this has been one common feature in the communist countries in Eastern and Central Europe. All this to say that in those parts of Europe where we haven't had engagement with this topic until recently, now it has arrived. I can also share that over the last 2 or 3 weeks, the Portuguese Bishops' Conference has decided to set up an independent commission. The Spanish bishops have decided to set up a commission. As I said, the only ones lacking in the western part of Europe now are the Italian bishops. What has also become clear, and this is why I talk about the double crises with an E at the end, crises, is that people understand that priests commit crimes and commit sins. But what they don't understand, and this has become very clear after the McCarrick report, is that there is this systematic and systemic cover-up by bishops and by the hierarchy over the last decades. And therefore, now we talk a lot about allegations of cover-up and negligence by bishops, by cardinals, and even the Pope. The impression is that they don't get it, and how could this happen again? Again and again, even after Dallas Charter, even after the guidelines in the German Bishops' Conference had been introduced following the Dallas Charter in 2004, and so forth and so forth. Why don't we change? New issues that come up are the abuse of religious sisters, the abuse of seminarians. That was connected to especially the McCarrick report. The abuse of consecrated women was put on the agenda by the Pope himself when he spoke about it in 2019. Other areas that are of particular concern in discussion in the European context at the moment are spiritual abuse and abuse of conscience and the abuse of power. How does all this, sexual abuse, psychological abuse, emotional abuse, and spiritual abuse, relate to how we understand power, how we exercise authority, and how is this linked to our images of who we are as a church, who we are as religious, who we are as lay collaborators, who we are as priests. So in many parts of the world, as I said, you can still today, you can hear that we don't have cases, and this is a Western problem, this is an American problem, or an Irish problem, or a German problem. This is a problem of secularized societies, and among media it is, and in the general public, it is always a problem of celibate priesthood. On the other side, people accuse media that they make it up and that they want to destroy the church by talking over and over again and bringing it up over and over again. Now, there are journalists who hate the church, there are journalists who want to destroy it, but in my experience, and I've been working with hundreds of journalists over the last decade or so, very few are so unprofessional that they talk about something that did not take place. So where does the scandal come from in the first place? We are responsible. It's our fault. And if we are not clear and not consistent in our publication and public presence on this, why wonder when journalists and papers feed on that? I cannot do anything. This is not true. As I tried to say at the beginning, all of us can do something, and nobody needs to do everything. All of us can engage in conversation, can keep this very uncomfortable topic present, can demand that in our institutions, in our context, we do what needs to be done so that children and vulnerable adults are safe. It will go away, some people say. Yeah, I'm deeply convinced that it won't go away. All of us here, even the youngest ones, will probably need to be realistic about this. This is a generational task. And as the church moves on in glacial speed and changes also in regard to this very slowly, either we have much patience and invest energy, or we will be very deeply disappointed. Some people in the church say it's worse in other institutions. This is not true for two reasons. One, we don't know how the situation is in other institutions, because the only population that has been researched worldwide is Catholic priesthood, Catholic clergy in regard to this topic. No other group in population has received that interest in research like Catholic clergy. So one reason is we don't have the numbers. The second is, if a Catholic priest or religious abuses a minor, it is not the same like a sports trainer or a public school teacher or a head scout. We are and pretend to be different. We stand for something different. We stand for a church that proclaims the gospel of salvation and not of suffering. We, when we rest like this, when we celebrate liturgy, we proclaim something different, and people expect that we behave accordingly. And even if we commit mistakes and sins, they will forgive us if we acknowledge that we have done so. And there seems to be so much difficulty in acknowledging that. Then there are voices that say that there are many false allegations. I asked the head of the disciplinary section at the CDF, at the Congregation for Doctrine, some time back. I asked him, John, tell me how many false allegations come to your desk? And he has seen it from 2002 onwards, probably. And he replied literally, very, very few. As in any crime, there are false allegations, but seemingly not as many as some people expect. Then in the general public, there are those who say, do away with celibacy and you won't have abusive priests anymore. All scientific reports that we have and all reports that have been commissioned by governments like the Australian Royal Commission state literally that celibacy is not the cause for abusive behavior. It sticks in the mind of people, it sticks in the mouth of journalists. In any interview that you can give, they will ask you this question. And you can repeat it over and over again. Scientifically, there is no proof that celibacy as such leads to abusive behavior. There are other components around it, yes, that may contribute, but not celibacy as such. On the other side of the divide, you have people who say, do away with homosexual priests and you won't have abusive priests. Again, homosexuality as such does not lead to abusive behavior. Other components may contribute to that, but not homosexuality in itself. And then there's another thing that has been repeatedly shown or was also of general opinion, that women don't abuse. So when it comes to religious congregations, female religious congregations, we didn't know much about sexual abuse. We knew about physical abuse, emotional abuse, some serious kinds of psychological violence against minors, especially in foster homes and so forth, boardings. But of late, in the last 2 or 3 years, we get to know that, yes, probably the number of women who abuse sexually is higher than we had expected it to be. Why don't we talk and why don't we know much about that? Because it is, in all probability, even a bigger taboo than abuse by men. So, taking all this, Pope Francis in November 2018 had called for a meeting of the presidents of the Episcopal conferences, of the heads of the Eastern churches, of the male and female superior generals of major congregations for February 2019. And that was not only dealing mainly with what all bishops should know by now, how you listen to victims, what you do with perpetrators, but it tried to address the systemic questions under 3 headings. The responsibility of the ordinary, so fleshing out what a bishop, an ordinary means in canon law language, the bishop, or the provincial for religious. What they have to do to implement what is canon law and norms and what the respective guidelines ask them to do. The second day was dedicated to accountability. This is a new concept for the Catholic Church. We don't have a culture of accountability in the Catholic Church as a whole. And you can see that by the simple fact that when we try to translate accountability into the other 3 languages of the conference, into French, Italian, and Spanish, I could also add Portuguese, there is no word, no substantive, no noun that translates accountability in any of the 4 Romance languages, in none of them. Now, if you don't have a word for that, what does that mean? It means that you don't think about it, you don't talk about it, and surely you can't act accordingly. And these are the languages that are spoken by the great majority of Catholics around the globe. And the third day dealt with transparency internally. For example, how do we deal in the proceedings of a canonical trial? Until now, this is highly secretive. And the definition of the rights of the defendant, of the accuser, of the superior of the accused is vague at the best. There is nothing that would give certainty when we enter into a canonical trial how it is proceeding. You don't even know at which stage the trial is. Externally, how do we deal with media? I could give you lots of examples of how we mismanage and how we don't know how to deal with this social media world of today. Just one example concerning your country. In 2018, on 14th of August, the Pennsylvania report was published. Given that this is mid-August in Rome, there is nobody there. Rome is dead. Except for tourists, all Romans are outside. So, but we knew 2 months earlier that the report was going to come. 14th of August, Pennsylvania, report speaks about the numbers and for the first time talks about also the co-responsibility of bishops in neglectfulness and in denial and in cover-up. Response from the Holy See? Silence. Nothing. For a week. A week later comes Pope Francis's letter to the people of God in which he explains how he sees things. But a week from breaking the news to a sort of response in today's world is an eternity. And people a week later don't know even to what the response was meant to reply to. This is one example where I think we have a lot to do in changing. Now, what has changed are the Vatican city-state guidelines and the law in regard to safeguarding. And then, most importantly, in June 2019, a new law for the Universal Church was established with a nice name, You Are the Light of the World. It was Estis Lux Mundi, in which for the first time there is some attempt to define accountability and to give bishops co-responsibility for asking for accountability among their brethren. I'm not going to explain that in detail because we are not in a canon law seminar here, but for the first time, the concept of accountability has been introduced in an expressive way and in a universal way. And for example, in Poland, over the last 15 months or so, 10 bishops were asked to step down or were removed from office because of neglectfulness and cover-up in the respective dioceses as a result of this new law. Then 2 bylaws were changed in December 2019. For example, one that has to do with the secrecy around dealing with cases inside the church and the pontifical secret that was attached to that. The pontifical secret does not apply now, since December 2019, to these documents. So there is no reason why church officials can deny state authorities, if it is rightful in that constituency, to produce documents. A year later, there was what is called a vademecum, the explanation by the Congregation for the Doctrine how this law is to be applied, and maybe it was June last year, there was finally a long-awaited revision of the Book 6 of the Code of Canon Law, which incorporates a good deal of the recent changes. In 2002, after the Boston events, after Spotlight Revelation, St. John Paul II told some cardinals this time of trial will bring a purification of the entire Catholic community, a purification that is urgently needed. So this is not an enemy of the Church. This is not a psychologist. This is not a journalist. This is the Pope himself. Now, 20 years on, where are we? as a Catholic community? Have we really been purified? Pope Francis, in a letter to the priests, but that can be easily applied also to all of us, wrote, "We are firmly committed to carrying out the reforms needed to encourage from the outset a culture of pastoral care so that the culture of abuse will have no room to develop, much less continue. This task is neither quick nor easy. It demands commitment on the part of all. If in the past omission may itself have been a kind of response, today we desire conversion, transparency, sincerity and solidarity with victims to become our concrete way of moving forward. This in turn will help make us all the more attentive to every form of human suffering." So it is not only about legal proceedings. It is not only about paying money and doing reparation. It is very much a question of our attitude and whether we are willing to accept that there are people who have been harmed and who suffer in our midst, and they have been harmed and suffer because they were victims of abuse by clergy and religious and lay employees. And how do we take on our share in their suffering? So what could follow? I cannot do anything. Yes, you can do something. It will go away? No, it won't go away. We need to find a way to talk about our theology of sexuality in a way that people understand what the Catechism says, that sexuality is a gift and not a danger, is good and not bad, is something that should human beings make flourish and not become obsessive. A theology of safeguarding. For many years I'm also a theologian, and I have been wondering why men and women theologians have not taken on this issue in no part of the world. Consistently, there have been voices, there have been publications, but as a major voice and a main topic, where do you see that? Okay, over the last 3-4 years, quite a number of things have happened, but I doubt that this will come to a point where we can talk about a theology of safeguarding. Safeguarding as an integral part of our mission. As long as safeguarding is singled out and we have our expert commissions and we have personnel specialized in it only, we can forget that we will change as a whole. Because then it will become something that is delegated to those experts and to those commissions. You need them. You need to train them. You need to prepare them. You need to have them. But the main task of these offices would be to bring people on board so that the whole community understands that this is something we need to pay attention to in all our education, academic, social, and pastoral work. So my thesis is, why is it so difficult for us as a church to really come to grips with this? One, because it is, as such, very uncomfortable. But two, because we don't allow for it. And we don't realize how much of the trauma of victims of abuse is present in our midst. We don't acknowledge that, and we don't live through it. In psychotherapy, you would call it working through it, which means confronting yourself to the measure that is possible for you at a certain given time, and come back to it later when you have reached another level, and to come back later at another level again. So I believe that much of the suffering, much of the harm done is present in our midst in the Catholic Church, and it has emerged through the developments over the last 40 years. Since we talk about it, it has emerged. Like a traumatized person that has kept it away for 30, 40 years has now flashbacks. I believe something like that is happening to the Catholic Church now. And that has the same effect as flashbacks have for traumatized people. They get paralyzed, they get shocked, and they don't know what to do. So we need to get back from that split off content of the trauma and help that victims and their suffering is present, which would mean coming together. We need norms and law and changes in that, and a lot has happened, relatively much has happened over the last years in the church, but that is not sufficient. It needs also a change of the attitude. Canon law and psychology are one aspect, but theology must come along. In very few countries, dioceses and religious are united in this. Very often they are split, and don't imagine that the religious are united among themselves. Clergy and laity, I've seen some years ago that people, very highly committed laity in this country, got so fed up after the McCarrick report and Pennsylvania that they said, we will move on whether the hierarchy is with us or not. Now, this is not church. How can we really struggle together, discuss together, debate, and find bridges rather than breaking them up? So, when is this going to be over so we can get back to our real ministries? I believe this is our real ministry. This is what God is calling us to today. This is not all ministry. This is not that something that should absorb everything. But in the cases of abuse and in our engagement for and committed to safeguarding, we can see the major issues that the church has to face, our relationship with the world, with modern society, with media, with the communications world, with science as such, with power, with all kinds of types of relationships, how we focus our mission, what is in the center of our attention. All this can be linked to our area that we have been discussing this evening, because you can see every facet of that reflected in whether we are capable of listening to those who have been harmed, how we deal with the reality of that, and where we get the strength, the hope, and our commitment from. So I would like to finish by returning to the beginning. As I said, my main message is we need to own it ourselves. And each and everyone here in this room and online should consider a moment now or later this evening. What can you do? What can I do? So that we can be a safer place, a safer society, and a safer church. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Father Zollner. Don't run away. We have about 15 minutes for questions and comments. I open the floor. As I said, comments are also welcome and questions are welcome. And we have a mic that can go around. Anna is helping with the mic and Bruno is helping with the mic. And somebody has to break the ice. Yes, please. Excellent, Your Excellency.
Thank you. Thank you, Father Zollner. I just have a practical question. with the number of cases that the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith has, one of the things that's a bit frustrating for us bishops is the time when we have to wait sometimes 2 years or 3 years, even in one case that I have, and it makes it very difficult for the victims and for the parishioners where a priest is removed from. And I don't know if there's been any developments on that, but I think that's an area of needed improvement and a bit frustrating. Perhaps you have some information.
Thank you, Bishop. And I've heard this concern from a good number of bishops and provincials. Sometimes it is even longer than 3 years. And this is untenable for all parties involved. And one is, a few years back, there were 12 canon lawyers working on cases in the Congregation for Doctrine. Now, at the moment, I think it's 18. But you imagine, they deal with all allegations that come in from all over the world. Sometimes they determine that it goes back to the diocese or the bishops' conference where there are tribunals established and recognized, sometimes, or maybe quite often. But anyway, there are many cases that they have to deal with. Now imagine, in all languages that come in. Some years back there was no native Portuguese speaker among them, for example. They don't have clerks. They have to work out the whole process of taking evidence, of evaluation of the evidence, weighing it, coming to a conclusion, writing the verdict, and communicating the verdict. As you know, you don't get the motivation for the verdict. You get the final result. This is something that needs to change. I know that they have established some other measures now at the congregation. They have, I believe, they take more notes of how many cases from which countries and so forth and so forth. But for example, years ago we proposed that they engage the canon law students in Rome, who may be 250 or more, and in later stages, some of them at least could be employed during the summer months or so for helping, at least in clerk work. They would be introduced to how they deal with it, and the people in the CDF would get some help. Didn't happen. So on the other hand, you know, bishops are not very likely to send good men, even if there is a great need of personnel in Rome, because you never know when you get back your men, and therefore it is. I mean, honestly, if we compare the church for a moment, if you allow for that, if you compare it with a big company that has a crisis, no, big company that has a crisis, how much would this company do to do away with the problem as soon as possible? We don't do that. We drag it on. And we would need a decision on a global level to say, okay, for 5 years, let us do whatever we can do to clarify the cases from the past and to implement safeguarding today. If we all committed to that and we focus for 5 years, it would be not over, but it would be much less troublesome in 5 years' time. No, we don't do that. It's like, I have no explanation for that, because there's something irrational in that. There is something maybe connected to the paralysis that I was referring to before.
Thanks, but no thanks, I think. Yeah. Second question or comment? Yes, please.
Thank you very much. That was a marvelous presentation, hard-hitting to the core. My name is Louis Manzo. I'm a retired priest living here on campus, but thank you very much. There's so many things I could say about this. I have some personal experience with this whole thing. I come from the Diocese of Buffalo, and we had a priest in the parish who was notorious. All the boys in the high school had nicknames for him that I could not repeat in this company. But in the end, when the parents eventually went to the bishop to complain, because when he went after the high school boys, they brushed him off or not. But so the parents went to the bishop, and he made him chaplain at a boys' home. So that was, I mean, an example of just utter carelessness. But what I wanted, there's so many things to be said about this. That quotation from John Paul II rather upset me a little bit, that this is a purification for the Catholic community, something like that. The issue is clerical sexual abuse. This is an issue. The clerical caste has to be reformed, and I don't think the burden should be laid on the poor parishioners who come to celebrate Mass and drop some money in the basket.
Thank you. I would slightly disagree with that, because over many decades and in many instances, parishioners were bystanders, and they knew what Father was doing, and they condoned it, and they did not act on what they knew or what they sensed. They were looking away. This is also true for parents with whom victims, when they had the courage to share that, came and the parents would brush them away. I don't think it is only a clerical thing. It has also to do with all our imagination and image of the church. I've heard stories over the last hours since I have been here that a grandmother, I was with students this morning, so one said her grandmother would not hear about it today, would not speak about it. So it is something that is not only, I mean, we talk about clerical sexual abuse. We don't talk about abuse of Catholic family fathers with their children or children of other people. Our focus is very much on clerical sexual abuse because, yes, as I said before, as priests and religious, we pretend to be of a different kind and so forth. However, I believe, again here, it is not as if we can just forget about the other part. Communities have had also their responsibilities, maybe to a different degree, but not complete. I would not completely exempt them from that.
Thank you. Scott?
Thank you, Father Zollner, for this very intense and useful, helpful presentation. When you said just a moment ago, I forget exactly how you put it, we priests pretend to be, how you put it, above it all. But it's not just pretend or presume. I'm speaking to you in your role as a theologian now. This is the theology of the priesthood for many decades. The theology of the priesthood that you are different ontologically as a result of ordination. And so my question is, I'm well outdated on these questions, whether there has been, partly stimulated by the sexual abuse crisis, a reflection on how seminarians are taught about what holy orders means vis-a-vis their relationship to God and to the laity and the mark that is on their soul as a result of the sacrament, and especially how that's been interpreted psychologically and socially within the priesthood, which is, I think, my argument would be, it's been interpreted in part in the direction that has led to clericalism, that we are a besieged, and there's some evidence there, a besieged minority within the church, but is also elite and is substantively ontologically different. And therefore, it's not just a matter we pose, but is it still the case that that is the teaching in the seminaries of the theology of the priesthood, the alter Christus? And can we learn from these terrible experiences within the priesthood itself? And I take your point about this is bigger than the priesthood. But on the point of the priesthood, can this crisis be a moment of purification theologically?
I certainly believe it can be. I'm not sure whether and when it will be. I don't see much of a theology of the priesthood that would help at this point to redefine, not redefine, to think in a different way about priesthood. I'm not aware of major theological debate on this. And you see how complex and intricate things are, because what you have described is true, that one element in the perpetuation of abuse and the cooperation with evil by superiors and peer priests was that we stick together because we are a different caste. That was an important element. You cannot explain why then, in some cases, it is not the same. It has not been the same. There are priests who are on less clerical list, as you would be able to describe that. But what I want to say is that within theology and in canon law, which reflects that theology, there is this combination of all spiritual power and the special ecclesiological role and ministry of the orders. Now, how we get around that without doing away with any kind of hierarchy, I don't know. Because it's an illusion that when you do away with all orders in the broad sense, that all are equal, that all will go well. Of course it won't. In any kind of institution, you have a hierarchy, like in a university, right? And power is there. Power does not go away. If you don't have power as a dean, somebody else will have it. So the question is, how do we define power, and how do we inform and teach and train people how to exercise? And the more important piece in this would be, and a novelty for us, how we limit power structurally and institutionally by some processes, like in other areas is called auditing, or giving account, or supervision. We don't have that, neither for bishops nor for priests. And I think we need to learn something from other areas where this is normal, and where things like ongoing formation are normal. When I give lectures around the globe, those who are always missing, always, are diocesan priests. And the great majority of the audiences that I've addressed are always women, with few exceptions. To your point about how priests also deal with the sense of being confronted and attacked and besieged, I listen to many priests who feel very uncertain about their priesthood today, and they feel that they can't do anything because whatever you do could be interpreted as an abuse, going as far as, you can't even demand rightful things, because you could always face an allegation of, oh, he has mistreated me. So where does abuse of power start and where does it end? Oh, that is interesting also in other contexts, like in a university. Huh? What I would like to underline is that I think that we really need to talk about a different model of priestly formation. Because as it is now, the seminary that was the structure of a seminary as we know it today has been introduced by the Council of Trent in 1560 or so. And it was very useful at that time. Very useful to give structure, to give academic excellence, and to form a cohesive presbyterate. Yes. I don't think it is helpful today, because the seminarians are shut off very often from normal life and from normal duties. And they are, I mean, they are introduced to a system where they are among themselves, and they are catered to with food, with washing, with whatever you have. So there is a danger that it continues in the line of sense of entitlement and little princes. I have no real alternative in this moment for the seminary structure as we have it. But what I'm really convinced of, and I say this as a consultant for the Congregation for Clergy, and I spoke to the Archbishop's secretary last week about this, of the congregation. We need to look out for other models of preparation for seminarians and for, also religious, in which contact with normal life and with the people who they encounter mostly in parishes is guaranteed. With whom are they normally in seminaries? Men. Whom do they meet in the parishes? Women and children. This is one aspect, but okay.
Quick, over dinner. Your deanship, you're invited to dinner. Yes. Friends, we are running out of time, so it's time to say thank you. Round of applause for Father Hans Zollner. I want to thank all of those of you who made this event possible, our colleagues at the Nanovic Institute. Terry Keeley again, thank you, Terry, for making this possible. Thank you for being here, and those on live stream. We have a little gift. It is not a bottle of wine, it is not a book. Look at this. I read it to you what it is. You can get used to holding it in your hands. The title is Learning. A comparison between the domes of the Papal Basilica of St. Peter and the main building of the University of Notre Dame. The artist is Gregory Young, who graduated with a Bachelor of Architecture in 2016 from our university. Greg Young is from a small town in Alabama and a convert to Roman Catholicism. His primary interests are in finding ways classical culture and civilization can be relevant and inform us in a modern world. He has chosen architecture as the mother of the arts to be the central way in which he explores these themes. And of course, you will put this in your office, and whenever people come to your office all over the world, they will see, oh, Notre Dame. Thank you, Father Hans, for being here.